Many of you know the DSM. So if you want to interrupt me, basically I'm going to go for about 45 minutes and then we'll have 15 minutes. But if you have a question or a concern while I'm speaking, don't hesitate to interrupt me. So as you know, the DSM-5 is in its, technically, numerically, its 5th revision, but actually there have been more revisions because they used R and TR for interim revisions and updates, but it's been in press since 1952. It has changed dramatically since the first DSM. I'll point out that the DSM-5 from 2000, from the previous one took approximately 20 years, because essentially this was just like typos and minor corrections. And you'll notice that the American Psychiatric Association has gone from Roman numerals to Arabic number, and this is very intentional. And it's very intentional because they don't want to be constrained with the R for revision or TR for text revision. So we can expect to see numerous and periodical revisions. So get your checkbooks ready. The DSM 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and so forth. And that's not an insignificant purposive choice that they made. It's very intentional. So some of the goals in the evolution from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, they wanted to, obviously APA wanted to incorporate new and more current research information, clinical information about psychiatric syndromes and disorders. They also wanted to align the DSM-5 with the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases, published by the World Health Organization, which is not yet out, which is actually now going to field trials. As you know, in the US, we are slightly behind the curve when it comes to ICD. We're still using ICD-9, and we've delayed transitioning to ICD-10, which was published 20 years ago. We'll probably transition to ICD-10 right about when ICD-11 comes out. Everybody else is using ICD-10, and we'll move to ICD-11 probably in 2016. They also wanted to create a more dimensional system of classification, so they've totally abolished a multi-axial, where axes 1 and 2, and nobody really understood why 1 and 2 were different. One had psychiatric disorders, mental health disorders of a certain type, and axis 2 had personality disorders and intellectual disability, but autism was on axis 1, and nobody understood why autism was on a different axis than intellectual disability, and so they fixed that. No more axes. Now it's a dimensional system with specifiers. They also wanted to improve the validity of the psychiatric diagnoses and the reliability, the inner expert reliability, and time will tell if that's been done. And they want to improve the clinical utility by reducing the NOSs, the not otherwise specified. The estimate is about 30% of all psychiatric diagnoses were NOS diagnoses, which basically means I'm not quite sure what he has or she has, and it doesn't quite meet the criteria, but she or he has something. That's what that NOS meant. And that was very prevalent in PDD, pervasive developmental disorders. So I want to focus today, so in the DSM-5 there's over 350 or 355 conditions and categories. I want to focus on the neurodevelopmental disorders today, and more specifically autism and intellectual disability. So let's start with autism spectrum disorder, singular. And in the DSM-4, it was PDD, pervasive developmental disorders, which was on top. And under that, we had conditions such as autistic disorder, Asperger, childhood disintegrative disorder, which is completely gone now, Rett syndrome, which still exists but has moved out of autism as a specific genetic disorder. We've now found the gene. And PDD-NOS, which has been completely eliminated now under autism spectrum disorder. So in the DSM-5, we now have 2 broad categories. There were previously 3, which were qualitative deficits in social and qualitative deficits in communication skills. And those have been merged into one. So we have qualitative deficits in social communication and qualitative deficits in restrictive repetitive behaviors. And those are here, and I'll talk about those in more specifics. And then there's a third criterion, which is age of onset. So you have to have deficits in both of these, and they have to appear during the early developmental period. And we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so social communication disorders or deficits essentially have to be persistent deficits in social and communication aspects or social interaction across multiple contexts. All right, as manifested by these 3 elements. And the 3 elements are socio-emotional reciprocity, sort of social approach, failure to make normal back and forth, being socially engaged with other people, social interactions, that's the first one. The second one has to do with nonverbal communicative behaviors, so being able to communicate using nonverbal language, and those relate to eye contact, body language, are some of the core features that we're familiar with. And the third element is specific deficits in friendship, making friends, peer interactions, peer engagement, difficulties adjusting behaviors to suit or accommodate the social context that we're in. Right, so those are the 3 elements under social communication deficits. Immediately, you need to also specify what is the severity level. So that's also new. And the severity level is not high functioning and low functioning. All right, then that's an intentional. So do you find anything interesting in this first section? Anybody? Any concerns that you've had? How many of you have already started working with this new DSM-5 definition? Any comments?
I think one of the big changes was like you have to have all 3 rather than like 4 of 6 or whatever it used to be.
So who has said all 3?
No one, but that's I think how people are interpreting it. At least that's what I've been told you should do.
First line said, like you must have in the following.
Well, I think as far as my understanding, it's not specified. So the DSM-5 has chosen not to specify 1, 2, or all 3. Says you have to have these deficits, but there's a lot of question about whether or not that does mean all 3 or not all 3, and whether or not they're leaving it to clinical judgment. And Francis himself has criticized it, who was one of the authors of the DSM-4, specifically around this issue of lack of clarity. Because what's interesting is in B, restrictive repetitive behavior is very clear. So there has to be at least 2. Has to be at least 2 of the 4.
How does that actual text of A read if not before the 3?
Let's go back. So persistent deficits in social communication across multiple contexts as manifested by the following, currently or by history. And then they go into those 3.
3 elements theirs or yours?
No, that's mine, yeah.
So it doesn't say by all of the following.
It doesn't say all of the following. It doesn't
It also
say.
doesn't specify not all of the following.
Right. Yeah.
It seems like it's implied, but not written out.
Right.
But it's not as clear as this text here, which says manifested by all of the following, would have been much more specific and prescriptive. All right, so that's one of the concerns, but it's interesting that many of you have interpreted that as all 3 and others have, but it's not said specifically.
Well, the nature of restricted repetitive interests, it varies a lot, like what kind of ways it manifests. And so it would make sense that you would have to have all 3 of them because they look a lot different in different kids.
So it makes sense that you would have to have all 3?
That you wouldn't
You
have
would
to
not?
have all 3 in the B criterion.
Okay.
But couldn't you make the same argument for A?
I guess so.
All right, so for B, it's clear that you need to have 2 of 3. So these are the stereotype and repetitive behaviors, like use of object, echolalia when you're talking about speech, insistence on sameness, inflexibility to change in routine, fixated interests, strong attachment to certain topics, whether it's computers or games or storms. And then 4 is this hyperreactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment and so forth. A lot of the sensory aspects of it. So 2 or more of these. And here too you have to assess the severity as part of the diagnostic process. Other elements are the symptoms have to be present during early developmental period. So those of you who've been using it, what is that? The previous definition or the previous manual said that the diagnosis had to be made before the age of 3. When does the early developmental period end?
Do you think maybe they're providing room for the fact that clinical judgment is supposed to be the gold standard?
Clinical judgment is supposed to be, so clinical judgment is you decide when the developmental period ends?
For your kid.
Okay. Okay. I worry with clinical judgment being the gold standard, however.
I'm just basing this Luke here, and I'm basing it on what Luke says.
Katie?
You're reading on that I think intellectual capability and level of intellectual disability could have potentially a significant impact on how you're interpreting developmental period as well, and that's not talked about here. It's talked about as separate specifier.
Well, and if you think about like high functioning kids, like former Asperger's kids, a lot of time the social communication stuff doesn't pop up until later in life because they can handle those lower level demands.
Right. So I'm just perplexed by why they say early developmental period, not just developmental period. And I think my sense is that in part this ambiguity is really part of their effort to align with the ICD-11. Because the ICD-11 has a much more global application. And they've done the same thing with intellectual disability where they haven't operationally defined developmental period. Because in some countries, early developmental period may be defined differently in terms of chronological age than in the US or North America. That's one possible explanation. Just as good as the gold standard being clinical judgment, but not better necessarily. All right, and then these symptoms, and this is an important one. So they must cause significant impairment to be a disorder if they're just mild and are not impairing. And then the disturbances are not better explained by other things like intellectual disability or global developmental delay and so forth. So those are exclusionary aspects. This note is an important note, and this is where we see how politics enters the realm of science and clinical psychopathology. So APA decided and thought it was important to put this qualifier. I don't know if you can read it in the back, but note individuals with well-established DSM-4. So if you've already been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, whether it's autism, Asperger, PDD, or whatever, should be given the diagnosis automatically of autism spectrum disorder according to the DSM-5. So everybody is grandfathered into it. Now, if you haven't had the chance of having that diagnosis, now it's a whole new ballgame, right? Because now you're falling under these criteria. And there was a tremendous amount of consternation around case identification or caseness now under these new criteria. Who is going to be in and who is going to be out with this new addition versus the DSM-4. So this note was really inserted, and I don't know this for nobody's told me, but my best guess is this note was put in after a lot of political pressure, a lot of concern that people would be losing services, be out. And so this is put in, and sort of like now we start like a reset, right? And they call that a reset in computers or politics. Did you have a question?
Well, I was just like, what does well-established mean? So someone's diagnosed you with it, not done any standardized assessment, just said, hey, you probably have PDD NOS, like, does that count?
I would say yes. If anybody has mentioned that in your file, it's been, I mean, I don't know. But they obviously didn't say if you have a diagnosis, or a documented diagnosis. They chose these words very intentionally and willfully. So then the specifier, so this is the dimensional aspect of the condition or of the new manual, of the new DSM. So you specify with or without intellectual disability. There was a time where we used to say, 75% of people with autism had an intellectual disability, and now it's probably a lot closer to 50% than 75%. A lot of the people who are now under this condition are people who don't have a co-occurring intellectual disability. But you need to continue specifying it with or without language impairment, associated with a medical or genetic condition like Rett syndrome now would be one, or Fragile X, or another, or some environmental factor of some kind. Environmental factor could be fetal alcohol syndrome as an environmental etiology or factor. Or other associated neurological. Now in the DSM-5 it is permitted. Before it was not permitted to make a diagnosis, although everybody did, of ADHD with PH.D. But now they do specify you can. And then the last one with catatonia. So those of you who have been working with that, have you dealt a lot with this, with catatonia? So it's a mistake. It doesn't belong there. It's going to be taken out at the first edition.
Really? There's a couple reviews about catatonia and autism out there.
According to Catherine Lord, it's a mistake. It's not. It doesn't belong in there, and it shouldn't be in there, and it's going to be coming out.
Are they like copying and pasting from schizophrenia?
It's in the rush to get to the bank.
That's always what I thought until we had this kid that we thought maybe had this, and we started looking it up, and there are several reviews and a lot of case reports around this autism and catatonia phenomenon.
Yeah.
And also
They're supposedly
spawn a
a thing.
whole new line of research. Wait, so what's going to happen to these kids then? They're going to be moved to the schizophrenia category? Because what if schizophrenia is not the cause? What if they're really depressed or something?
But we've never had catatonia in the DSM before. I mean, not in part of PDD.
Diagnosis, because they still meet all of the criteria, it's just that
Right.
specifier that'll go.
Right.
I guess that's the thing.
And it can coexist. You can have coexisting diagnoses.
But we gave him depression with catatonia because we're like, this catatonia is not because of his autism. It's because we think he's also now suddenly very depressed.
Well, I'm going to tell you this because this is my sources. According to what I've been told, this is a mistake. So it's not. It shouldn't have been in there. There may have been some talk in the early stages, but in the final decision, it should have been out. But it ended up going in press. So be careful in using it. So what is really new are the severity.
Sorry.
Tara?
Can I go back to the with or without language impairment? So my first one is a question. Is a social language impairment considered a language impairment, or does that mean like a diagnosed language disorder?
Want to weigh in? I think it's interpreted here as what I call a structural language disorder.
Okay.
Though social language disorder is a language disorder. That's always been the
Okay.
difficulty with Asperger's.
Right.
Because one of the criteria was no early language disorder, but they had social language difficulties. But they were thinking of like
Okay.
grammar disorder.
Okay. Because it's just interesting, the wording that they chose almost implies that you don't need all three of the first communication criteria. Because if they're saying without language impairment, that would, if we're conceptualizing social language as a language impairment, it would almost kind of nullify the first criteria and suggest you can have autism without that first A.
Right.
Anything on social reciprocity though, it didn't have to be language.
It didn't have to be language.
Right. So you could have ASD without having a language impairment.
Right.
And the social communication is actually a different and a new criteria, which we're not going to talk about today, but which is social or pragmatic communication disorder.
Couldn't that also just include nonverbal communication?
Could, yep. Yep. All right, let's move on. So this is an important new change. This is, and it will be interesting to see how the gold standard of clinical judgment pans out here with respect to, because we're not told how to assess severity levels, but the severity levels have to be assessed based on support needs, not IQ, not language ability, Not those measures that we typically had assumed or used, but based on what is the support intensity around social communication deficits, what are the support needs around these repetitive and restrictive behaviors, and without wanting to be overly critical, the 3 levels that they came up with were requiring support, requiring substantial support, and requiring very substantial support, which will be interesting to see how we assess that to inform our clinical judgment. But right now, you're right, it's clinical judgment that we use to assess the severity levels of these 2 areas. And it'll be interesting to see if somebody requires some support for social communication, but requires very substantial support for repetitive restrictive behavior. What is the overall severity level? There is none. It's really by these 2 domains. So facts about prevalence, and this was what was fueling a lot of the debate and a lot of the concern. We know that prevalence has been increasing dramatically, 4-fold in the last couple of decades, even 30% in the last 2 years since CDC published their 2012 prevalence statistics. So prevalence is going up, and that is not unrelated to how we define it. It will be interesting to see how now. What's interesting, I think, is these statistics is that 30% of parents report having concerns about their child before the first birthday. And 80% say that they've had concerns even before or at about their second birthday, right? When the kids have a diagnosis. But what's interesting is that the median age for an autism diagnosis is closer to 5 or 6 years old. And the median age for an Asperger diagnosis was closer to 10 or 11 years old. So a lot of these parents have noticed some changes, have noticed that diagnoses were not being made or are not being made at a young age. And what's going to happen to the prevalence now with the DSM-5? And that's the big concern. And several papers got published on the first drafts and the later drafts of the DSM-5. McPartland and their colleagues published a paper where they reported that 30 to 45% of kids and adults with autism based on DSM-4 would lose their diagnosis with the DSM-5 criteria.
But isn't he referring mainly to kids with PDD, NOS, and isn't that one of the goals of the DSM-5 to stop using NOS and classify them as something that means something?
We'll see. But that's an excellent point. They didn't specifically address just PDD. They were talking about all of the autism categories, which was inclusive of PDD and NOS. But that's the question. The question is, are we, with this new ASD, are we really going to tighten up things and really continue to capture everybody who was autism or autistic disorder? And what will happen to those with Asperger, and what will happen with the PDD NOS?
Was that reporting on the DSM-5 field trials?
Yes, it was, which was the near final version. Yeah.
I've seen a couple studies that used like a retrospective review of records to get those numbers, and I wonder about that because when I write reports, I write it with the criteria in mind, so that if somebody's reading it to look at the criteria,
So like
that's
the
what pops
sensory
out.
one.
So
You
I
wouldn't
can't put
necessarily mention
everything
that.
in a report,
Right.
but what I'm gonna write in the report is gonna change based on what the criteria are for what I'm diagnosing. So I wonder if what clinicians put in there was consistent with DSM-4 criteria, but what they wrote was not necessarily consistent with DSM-5 criteria. 'Cause it didn't have-
So if they wrote for the DSM-5, you think that they would be more inclusive?
I think it's likely that many of those kids were showing symptoms that weren't mentioned in their report summary because that wasn't what they, when I write a report, I write it to make sure that somebody can read it and know what criteria I'm saying the child meets.
Maybe.
Because the main issue really is the repetitive behaviors in terms of like the PDD, NOS, and to the new autism spectrum disorder that you have type 2.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's the one that's causing the most problems,
But
really.
the sensory thing, was never part of autism. So if you're doing a retrospective chart review, a lot of people wouldn't even mention sensory issues because it wasn't part of a diagnosis before, where they could have been there.
What I'm wondering is if they don't meet criteria for ASD or if they also don't meet criteria for social communication disorder.
So that's a good question. Let's get to that. So another study by Gibbs, they looked at 132 kids, and 23% of their sample wouldn't meet criteria under DSM-5. When they look at those 23, there was no age or gender difference. But then the question is, well, those who don't meet, would they still meet it, however, for something very similar, which is the social pragmatic communication disorder? And that's a good question. That's an excellent question. So there's a really recent study that just got published with a large sample of South Korean kids on an epidemiological study where they specifically looked at DSM-4 versus DSM-5, and there was a small drop in prevalence, overall prevalence. So you can see the prevalence rate there is comparable to here. And when you look at the drop, and this is, I think gets to your question, is who's losing it? So those with the autistic disorder diagnosis pretty much retain in the DSM-5 a diagnosis, largely ASD. The 1% that doesn't meets the social communication disorder. The Asperger, we start having more diagnostic depth, if you will. 91% meet the criteria under DSM-5. 6% of the 9 meet it for social communication, and 3% get something else that's not ASD. This is where you have the big change, is in the PDD-NOS, at least in this study. And this study included Fonbon, who's an excellent epidemiologist. So 71% of the PDD-NOS continue to have a diagnosis of ASD. 22% of that sample end up with social communication disorder, and then the 7% sort of loses their diagnosis altogether. So there's a small change or small loss, but the loss is really happening pretty much where they anticipated or they expected. So this study will need to be replicated and is being replicated by others. So that's the whole question right now is, according to DSM-5, if you had a diagnosis, you still have a diagnosis, but the new cases will be interesting to see. All right. We'll have some more time. I just want to zip through the ID question. And I thought this was appropriate because while everybody was paying attention to autism and DSM-5 about what they were doing to autism spectrum disorder, APA was making some stupid choices about how they're going to rename mental retardation and what they were going to do there. And nobody was really paying attention to that. Until the very, very end. So in the DSM-5, the new condition is called intellectual disability, parentheses, intellectual developmental disorder. And this is part of the terminology. And why is that there? Consistency with ICD-11. However, ICD-11 is not using this anymore. ICD-11 has abandoned intellectual developmental disorder. They're going to be using disorders of intellectual development. So, 5.1, DSM 5.1, coming near you. So it's a disorder with onset during the developmental period. When is the developmental period end? Clinical judgment. Thank you. And it includes both intellectual and adaptive functioning deficits in conceptual, social, and practical domains. This definition now is in perfect alignment with, as Susan called it, the Bible, in which I agree wholeheartedly. So the DSM-5 and the AAIDD definitions are in perfect harmony, with the exception that AAIDD still defines a developmental period arbitrarily as ending at the age of 18. So they explain it here, why intellectual developmental disorder is used. They acknowledge that in the US, intellectual disability is the term of choice. It's in our federal law. It was passed by the president. That's what we're going to call it. It doesn't matter what DSM-5 calls it. Everybody else is going to call it intellectual disability. So the three criteria are deficits in intellectual functions, and that's the same. And this refers to assessment of standardized measures that are psychometrically sound, good IQ test, comprehensive measures of intellectual functioning. The DSM-5 intentionally made a lot of statements, especially to sort of arm mental health professionals working in the field of forensic. Although there's a note in the DSM-5 that says it shouldn't be used or should be used cautiously in the field of forensic. But they reiterate the importance of the 5-point standard error measurement. So an IQ test is not precise, it's not perfect. And when they say significant deficits are 2 standard deviations below the mean, it's not an absolute score of 70, it's approximately 70. And they also say that it's important to factor in other sources of error on standardized tests, like practice effect and Flynn effect and so forth. So the second prong, which is adaptive behavior, and this is where you see that the DSM-5, in my opinion, was a little sloppy when it went to press. Because here they refer to deficits in adaptive functioning as meaning deficits in one or more of these: communication, social participation, and independent living. But that's not what we're measuring. What we're measuring is conceptual, social, and practical. So here on page 33, you have these 3 domains, and then the rest of the DSM-5, you have actually conceptual, social, and practical. So don't get confused. This is what you're measuring. Conceptual, social, and practical are the domains that are defining adaptive behavior. All right, and we should use, in addition to the gold standard of clinical judgment, we should use standardized measures, as well as corroborating information and records review and so forth to assess the person's adaptive functioning, such as this. Now, this, I think, is really a sad moment in the time of the DSM-5 because, and I'll come back to this in a second, because here they do such nice work by saying intellectual disability is a disorder with onset during the developmental period that includes both intellectual and adaptive deficits. They have intentionally moved away from deficits in intellectual functioning that cause or that result in or that are associated with. So there's no association now. You can have deficits in intellectual functioning and deficits in adaptive functioning, and we don't know what the relationship is. We don't know what comes first. We just know that you have both. And then they muck it all up with this statement on page 38. To meet diagnostic criteria for intellectual disability, deficits in adaptive functioning must be directly related to intellectual impairment. So, those of you who do diagnosing in the clinics, how do you show this? How do you assert this in a report and back it up empirically or clinically?
Well, I think maybe they were trying to use that wording so that people didn't say that a person had deficits in adaptive functioning related, say for example, to psychosis, and so therefore they must have intellectual disability. You know what I'm saying? That it needs to be not due to a lot of other things.
So why don't, well, let's say you're right, Jessica. Why don't they say that in relation to deficits in intellectual functioning that's not related to psychosis, right? They could have deficits in intellectual function.
To anything that maybe is not, well, how would you reword it, you know?
I would take it out entirely. I mean, because you could have an intellectual disability if your functioning is this, and the etiology is unimportant and is not really determinant. It doesn't matter what causes the functioning. It's a purely functional definition. Could be you're hit by a car, you fall out of a tree, you have anoxia during delivery, you have a gene that results in this, you have an environmental insult, or you have, schizophrenia at the age of 4, which, if it were possible, that causes this, you have intellectual disability. My beef is that they, yet again, make intellectual functioning or IQ the most important aspect.
Clinically, my challenge with this has been that now we're saying adaptive functioning level is how we're defining severity and not IQ.
We haven't seen that yet, yeah.
Well, but I'm saying related to this. And the issue has come up when, for example, we have a child who has an IQ of, say, 65, but they have adaptive functioning in the 40s, but they're severely depressed. And how do I kind of resolve those two things and figure out, well, is this really more of a moderate intellectual disability? Or is it a mild intellectual disability and depression that's kind of furthering pushing down those scores? Because we have to move an IQ of 100.
Hold that thought. We'll get to the severity level in a minute. Hold that thought. All right, so I'll tell you, I think the DSM or APA has really made a lot of efforts to de-emphasize the importance of intellectual functioning in intellectual disability, and actually has tried to place adaptive behavior in a more of the driver's seat. And that's illustrated by the severity levels, the specifier for severity levels, which are now determined not on IQ, no longer by IQ, but now the severity levels are now determined by the person's adaptive functioning level. And that is a paradigm shift and a half. That's a huge paradigm shift. And why would they do that?
That's what matters in the real world.
Funding, I'm sure it's funding.
Funding.
They're going to need more funding if they've got their IQ is 69, but they've got terrible repetitive behaviors. They might end up needing a lot more funding.
So what I hear you say is funding, but what I think you're saying is support needs, right? The support need of a person is probably a lot more driven by their adaptive behavior, and we know it fluctuates, and we can impact that a lot more than their IQ. Because as you know, you can have two individuals, kids or adults, who both have an IQ of 65, but require very different support needs, right? Depending on their adaptive behavior, mental health, problem behavior, physical health. And so adaptive functioning is a lot more sensitive to those aspects than IQ. So the levels of severity for intellectual disability, and Katie stole my thunder, is now based on adaptive functioning under conceptual, social, and practical. Now this is another regrettable move by APA, is that they kept the same 4 levels: mild, moderate, severe, profound. So what do you all think is going to happen? All of those old clinicians who've always worked with the DSM, mild, moderate, severe, profound, what are they going to think it means? 55 to 70, 40 to 55, 25 to 40, and less than 25. Now, why didn't they come up with 4 new names like needs some adaptive behavior help, needs a lot more adaptive behavior help, needs a very, very... Now, I don't know what's going to happen if you have mild support needs or adaptive behavior for conceptual and moderate and then profound. Does that mean your severity level for intellectual disability is somewhere in between that? Is it the highest? Is it the lowest? It's the gold standard. I mean, it's basically left, I don't want to pick on you anymore, I'm sorry. They basically leave it entirely to clinical judgment. It's really into clinical judgment on the clinician decides which is primacy, what is the most important. So if you have an IQ of 55 or 65, what was the IQ you said?
So if you have an IQ of 65, but adaptive behavior of 40,
right,
and you have severe depression.
Well, then you can't say that. You have to say that they're coexisting and you can't determine unless the depression is adequately treated and the individual is reassessed. I mean, why are you forced to make a decision?
Aren't you? when you're diagnosing? I mean, you're supposed to put the level of severity in there.
Well, what if you can determine? I mean, it sounds like in that situation, you cannot at this time determine,
What if they need supports?
but they still need support.
But Betsy and I, yeah, we're assuming that the depression is not being controlled. If the depression is being treated and controlled, and their adaptive behavior is in the 40s or is in the moderate range, then their functioning is in the moderate range. If their depression is being treated and their symptoms are not impacting their functioning, it's a co-occurring mental health problem. Now, I agree with Betsy. If their depression, by your clinical judgment, is not well controlled and is impacting their behavior and we need to stabilize it, just like if you were to assess their intelligence and they come in and their depression and their symptoms are influencing their functioning and their cognitive ability, you would retest them at a later date. I would say the same thing would apply here.
Like a year later?
Yeah, maybe you say, provisional, and then reassess when mental health is stable.
Something, an everyday example is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because so many kids with autism also have the ADHD confound, but at the same time you have the pragmatic issue of you need to serve them now. You can't wait until their ADHD has been better controlled, even if anybody's identified it, which is unusual. So.
So those are the severity levels for intellectual. So both autism and intellectual disability have different severity levels, driven in part by different things. And what's interesting is that there is a relationship, because in the DSM-5, one of the justifications to abandon IQ as the driver for severity level is that adaptive behavior correlates better with support needs. And they say that specifically. So we see that in the DSM, there's a lot more emphasis placed on adaptive functioning and support need versus intellectual functioning. Now in the DSM-5, some of us were a little bit excited to see this, because they said the diagnostic coding, if you open up your DSM-5, mild is 319, moderate is 319, severe is 319, and profound is 319. So you sort of thought, well, great, it doesn't matter. Really, because the codes are the same, so the funding is going to be the same, right? Oops, no. We made a boo-boo in March. They republished a document saying, no, that was a mistake. Of course we're going to give different codes because they drive different dollar levels, right? So the real codes are these, and they're aligned with the ICD-11 codes. So that was a mistake. 5.1 is soon going to be in your Borders bookstore. So the similarities and differences, I'm almost done. So the terminology is, for all intents and purposes, the same. So pretty much everywhere in the world except the UK, where they still use learning disability, we use intellectual disability for this condition. IQ criterion is the same, adaptive behavior criterion is the same. When we talk about DSM or ICD-11, and ICD-11 will be identical, or AIDD. Age of onset, again, the DSM-5 intentionally did not specify. And again, I think it's really in their effort to harmonize with ICD-11, because the developmental period is different in different countries depending on their level of development or what have you.
Isn't it legally under age 22 in America, like for legal purposes?
So that's a good question. So there's a little bit of confusion, because the age 22 really relates to the federal statute of developmental disabilities. And there are people who have an intellectual disability who meet criteria for developmental disability, and there are people who have intellectual disability who do not. So the developmental disability umbrella doesn't automatically overlap with ID. So the age 22 is for an entirely other classification group, not a diagnostic group. It's really an administrative group in the US, because outside of the US, developmental disabilities doesn't exist as a category. And that's where we find age 22, which is in the federal definition of developmental disabilities, as well as in the school system of developmental disabilities. But when you look within the Social Security Administration, when they define intellectual disability, it's still age 18.
So for example, if a student aged 20 years old had a bad car accident and had a brain injury that rendered them, so for example, intellectually disabled, what would happen with that at age 20?
So they might qualify for developmental disability, but they would not qualify because of the age cutoff for intellectual disability. And if that same accident happens when they're 23, they don't qualify for anything except maybe TBI or acquired brain injury.
But do they qualify for ID now, though? If your clinical judgment says that age 20 is still within the developmental period?
So,
Developmental irresponsibility is a club software cousin.
so isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So what if you decide that based on your clinical judgment, age 25 is the end of the developmental period, because that's when the brain really continues to develop. Right. And what if I say, no, I believe in precociousness, and I think most kids are really finished developing by the age of 16. And I stop diagnosing after 16, age of onset. Doesn't that create a really hot mess, right? Because if we leave it to clinical judgment, it could be.
It does.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
You know, so you just
Yeah.
have to hop around psychologists till you find the one that goes up to the age you need them to go up to.
If you have the resources to help psychologists.
Because isn't adolescence now redefined as going up to age 25?
Well, yeah,
So,
Is that right?
because that's when the prefrontal cortex stabilizes.
Or you're on your parents' health insurance until you're
27, 26?
27.
Yeah.
You're living in your parents' basement.
All right, well, I'm almost done. So in conclusion, at least with respect to ID, it could be confusing that we have that parenthetical intellectual developmental disorder, although I think nobody is going to use it, except probably the APA author, the DSM-5 authors. To meet diagnostic criteria, it's really regrettable that they've inserted this sentence, that it must be directly related to intellectual impairments, because I think clinically, it's virtually impossible to document that. And as Susan mentioned, I do some forensic cases, and if you're in a court, whether it's a state court or a federal court, and an attorney says, Dr. So-and-so, can you really, the DSM-5 says this, can you really show me that these adaptive behaviors relate to this person's intellectual deficits? And I'd have to say no, because I can't.
Then your diagnosis isn't valid.
Of course.
well, what about if they put must be in the context of?
5.2. Let's try working on
We
that.
have two criteria. We have to have all three of them. It's redundant.
I guess that's the question: is why does criterion B have to relate to criterion A? Why? If we don't say that impairments in repetitive behaviors have to relate to impairments in social communicative or communication for ASD.
What would you say must be co-occurring then?
I would just say, yeah, you have deficits in both. Intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. Point. End of story.
The same person.
The same. All right. The adaptive behavior domains are these three, which are pretty much well established. There's no clear definition. So that, as you say, raises the whole specter of what is the age cutoff? Is it 15? Is it 18? Is it 22? Is it 25?
Well, I mean, I think eventually it's going to be death, right? Because now that your brain continues to develop throughout life, really.
Well, yeah, except I think it starts developing in the other direction.
It's for the future, yeah.
All right, that's it. Thank you.